Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Foreign Correspondents Club of Japan here in Tokyo. And today's professional event. I'm Anthony Rowley, a former president of the club, and I'll be acting as moderator today. And welcome to the latest of what we call our deep dive events. As some of you know, these are events where we ask panels of experts to look at issues of current interest. And today's topic, I think, is certainly of current interest, which is China's economic slowdown. How serious for China and for the rest of the world? And we have three experts with us today, and I'll introduce them in the order in which they'll be speaking. I'll introduce them briefly and then a little more fully later. So to my right here is Mr. Albert Park, who is Chief Economist and Director General of Economic Research and Development Impact Department at the Asian Development Bank in Manila. Second speaker, you can't, well, yes, you can see her online, I hope, is Lyric Hughes Hale, who is Director of Research at Hale Strategic and Editor-in-Chief of EconVue, based in Chicago, and her work focuses primarily on China and Asia. And to my left is a well-known face, Jesper, Koll, who is Global Ambassador and Expert Director at the Monex Group Japan Catalyst Fund. So I will get quickly into the debate because you want to listen to the experts and not to me. But as I said, obviously this is a very important issue. China has been very much in the news, and I think a lot of people want to know how serious the slowdown is, how serious the impact will be on Japan and the rest of Asia, and indeed on the wider world. So without further ado, let me introduce Mr. Park, please.
Sure. Good morning. It's a real pleasure to be back here at FCCJ to talk about an issue which is getting quite a lot of discussion and attention recently. Let me start by summarizing Asian Development Bank's growth and inflation forecast for China. The last time we released a forecast was in July, and at that time we were projecting growth this year of 5%, which is in line with, of course, the government's own growth projections, and growth of 4.5% next year. And we will be issuing an update to that forecast in a couple of weeks. And it's likely there might be a slight downward adjustment, but not a large adjustment. And that reflects kind of an assessment of our research team, both in Manila headquarters, but also our country economist team in China, which we've been following very closely the data, of course, and the policy responses. China, of course, is a very complex economy, as it must be as one of the world's largest economies. And so I think it's important to try to take a holistic view when certain data points come in. And we've been trying to do that. I have a few slides to share. The first is presents on the left-hand side a measure of mobility, which is subway ridership in China. And one thing that jumps out, of course, is that after China left the zero COVID policy at the beginning of the year, you saw a very fast return to regular rates of mobility, at least as measured by subway use. In fact, levels of mobility even higher than pre-pandemic. So there was certainly a change in activity of ordinary Chinese citizens. On the right-hand side, we plot the kind of PMI indicators, which look at services, manufacturing, and construction. And of course, as you know, anything above 50 is expansionary, and anything below is kind of contractionary. And you can see, of course, again, there was a increase in activity following China's leaving zero COVID policy, but those gains have really moderated in recent months. Now, all of the indicators are still slightly above 50, so it's not like the Chinese economy is collapsing, as some people like to imply, but it does seem that the bounce back effect that we were expecting in China as it came out of the pandemic measures has not really had legs. It's been a very sluggish recovery, still doing fine on a number of measures, but showing a lot of concern, I think, or warning signs in other measures. So let me talk about some of the encouraging news first. If you look at data on consumption, and of course, there's been a lot of focus on the confidence of Chinese consumers. In the first half of this year, Chinese consumption grew by 7.6%, which was like a 10 times higher rate of increase than the year before, but that's from a very low kind of comparison point. And real household incomes increased by 5.8%, again, nearly doubling from the comparable period in the previous year. Retail sales grew by 7.3%. Now, if you just heard those numbers, you would think, oh, that looks fine. Not only is consumption grown fairly robustly in the first half of the year, but it's been growing faster than incomes, which means that savings rates are declining and that Chinese are kind of drawing down some savings to finance consumption. And that's what we would expect coming out of a pandemic period where it was hard to spend money for physical limitation limits or mobility limitation limits. We also have expected and have seen a quite robust recovery in kind of contact-related service sectors, hospitality, transportation, and generally a more robust response in the service activities than in purchase of manufacturing goods. Now, how has the recovery been sluggish? I would say the biggest concern right now is the property sector, because there's been such bad news in the numbers, what's happening in the housing market in China, which we all know has been a very important contributor to growth in China in the past. Indicators of consumer confidence are low. We've seen a very limited kind of recovery in purchases of durable goods by Chinese consumers. And of course, housing purchases, very little activity. We've also seen a less than robust return of Chinese tourists to international travel. And we've seen data that import demand has also been not growing very much, which suggests some limitation on the demand for goods of Chinese consumers. Although, most countries that went through the pandemic, when they came out of it, during the pandemic, they were buying goods because they couldn't spend on services. And once things opened up, they kind of shift back. And so we're not sure whether, how structural this is and how cyclical it is. And so that's a real, I think, at the core of thinking about how to interpret data coming out from China. How much of it is structural, reflecting some genuine concern of a long-term decline of the Chinese economy, and how much is cyclical, where there's some aspects where the recovery from the pandemic is slow, but there's still room for a recovery that could bring growth rates up looking into next year and beyond. Let me go to the next slide. And here I want to talk about the impact of China on the rest of Asia. So the figure here shows that imports in the first 7 months of this year actually declined in China, measured in value terms. And the sector that showed the biggest decline was this electronics and machinery sector. The right-hand side of this figure kind of shows how much of that trade is coming from countries in Asia. And this decline in demand for electronics and machinery, roughly about half of it represents a decline in demand of goods coming from other major countries in Asia. And the ones that have been particularly hurt are, I listed here, it's Type A China, it's Korea, Japan, Singapore, some of the more advanced economies in Asia that have been exporting these goods to China. And we know a lot of those economies have kind of struggled in general this year due to weakening export demand. And this figure shows that that decline in export demand is not just coming from advanced countries. Some of it is also coming from China. Now, some people have pointed out that this decline in the value of import demand in China is a little bit misleading because the volume of the quantity of exports has not declined nearly as much, has been roughly stable. That's still not great news. We would like to see expansion coming out of the pandemic. But that, so some of this decline, or quite a lot of it, is reflected in just changing prices in international trade. Let me talk about other ways in which China is affecting other economies. And one thing I want to point out is that I think most people think a big risk factor now is the property sector and whether it's going to recover or continue going down. And we did some analysis about how China's property sector affects other countries in the region and found that those effects are relatively limited because, you know, if China's property sector sinks, it really affects the construction sector of the economy, some of the services, especially financial services sectors as well. These are relatively weakly linked to other economies in the region. So we see a very slight decline in growth in other regions. With, you know, some nearby neighbors like Mongolia, to some extent Taipei, China as well, see a bit larger declines if China's property sector has a real bust, you know, in the coming years. But the channels are not that strong from the property sector. But of course, if property sector collapse affects overall consumer and investor sentiment, then it could, of course, affect demand for all sorts of goods and services coming from rest of Asia or other parts of the world. So one point I wanted to make about China's involvement in other economies in the region is that, you know, there's a lot of discussion now about decoupling, de-risking, reshoring, and we have definitely seen a relatively sharp reduction in FDI into China from other countries. If you look at the balance of payments data, it looks a little bit better than if you look at some of the more direct FDI indicators. But there's definitely been a reduction. And of course, some of that could be due again to things that were happening during the pandemic and the difficulty of completing deals. But we also know, of course, that there's been a chilling effect given all of the uncertainties about the China market, given geopolitical kind of tensions, et cetera. We know US investment in particular is way down into China. And so that has become apparent in the FDI data. And there's been some research by the IMF, which has shown that FDI flows globally have become more political, meaning that FDI has started to move more to countries that are closer politically to your country than before. And that's actually true even if you exclude data on China. This is a global kind of pattern that is now being seen in the data, and we'll see to what extent that continues. However, the record on trade is quite different. I think trade data shows that China is still very much interlinked with other countries in the region. At Asian Development Bank, we have had a very long-standing, strong commitment to supporting regional economic cooperation and integration. We have encouraged all of our member countries to continue supporting multilateral trade and investment frameworks. The message from this year's G20, led by India, the declaration that just came out, also endorses the importance of an open multilateral trading system. Asia, I've had an opportunity to speak to government leaders in many countries in the region. I think there really is this sentiment that most countries, that most leaderships in the region still would like to have healthy, open trade relationships with all countries in the world. And many countries, of course, in the region have benefited greatly from an open trading system in the past. And what is, I think, promising in Asia is that It's backed up by real commitments in the form of the RCEP agreement, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement. So there's a framework to codify commitments to open trade and investment, although RCEP still in many ways is early in its implementation. And we're still trying to understand how different countries can really benefit from its opportunities. In principle, though, it should allow for the development of more developed and complex value chain relationships among countries in the region. And because of this kind of institutional commitment, we feel it's a good vehicle to promote at least regional economic integration, which perhaps can be not a bulwark, but a way that countries in the region can have some confidence that open trade and investment can continue in a meaningful way and create economic opportunity without tremendous uncertainty, hopefully. We think that's really important. There was a very interesting report that just came out last week from the Peterson Institute in Washington, D.C., where they pointed out that the IPEF countries, so this is the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework Initiative led by the United States, that the partners in that framework are receiving more than 30% of their imports from China, and they send 20% of their exports to China as of 2021. And not only is that a very strong connection, but it's increased over time, not decreased. So both these import and export volumes with China have increased something like 40% over the last decade or so. So that's suggesting increasing economic integration. We've also looked at the data on global value chains and found that China's exports of intermediate goods, about 40% of them went to other countries in Asia, and that this share also increased noticeably since the trade war started, US-China trade war. Also, 35% of China's imports of intermediate goods come from other countries in Asia, which is just to say that China remains very well integrated and increasingly integrated with other economies in the region. And related to this, and related to kind of US-China geopolitical tension, most of the simulation analyses that have been done to say what happens to different countries if there really is a sharp decoupling where countries choose to pick sides, US group, China group, most of those analyses find that it's not really the US and China that are hurt the most, because these are big economies with big domestic demand and a large set of diversified trade partners. They have ways of managing these things. It's really the small guys, the smaller countries that trade with both the US and China who get hurt the most. And we know how competitive China is in many industrial activities, sectors. If countries are delinked from that, delinked from China, if as kind of a prerequisite of trading with the US, they become very uncompetitive very quickly. And I think, so the message here is that I think we hope that countries in Asia, especially the smaller economies, will not be asked to choose sides, that there are clear limits put on decoupling, and it's not, I think many economists, including leading US economists like Janet Yellen and the conversation, they've all said, we don't want to decouple, that's not our goal is not to keep China down. And so hopefully the growing tensions will not lead us there. But we don't know what will happen. Okay, maybe next slide. So let me say just a few words about the property market. And here on the left-hand side are some indicators of investment, real estate investments, sales, land area, et cetera. You can see they're all negative. So this is definitely creating a drag on growth, negative growth, really. And I guess the issue is this a crisis that's going to get worse and worse, or is this something that the Chinese economy is just trying to work itself out of? I think it's important to realize that to some extent, this pattern reflects a very conscious strategy of the Chinese government to deleverage a sector which had really been overdeveloped in a sense. So if you look at the data, a lot of the problems in China are in the tier 2, tier 3 cities. The demand is relatively stable in the tier 1 cities. And the problems in the smaller cities really reflect kind of some institutional characteristics that led to really excessive investment in this sector and overcapacity, a lot of empty apartments. It's been well documented. And this is because in China, local public finance is driven by the housing market. So cities have an incentive to develop new apartments, et cetera, because it actually feeds into their revenue and gives them a way to then invest and grow the economy in a institutional context where there's a lot of incentives for local leaders to try to promote growth. And that has been happening for quite a long time. And I think the government in China has realized this is a problem. It's a structural imbalance that has to be kind of fixed. And so China has for now some years been trying to deleverage the sector, and that's going to be painful. And we're seeing it, right? And I guess the question is whether there's any hope that this will work itself out in the sense that as demand continues to grow, hopefully as the consumer comes back, that eventually we'll get to a point where there is a positive but much smaller kind of contribution of the property sector to Chinese growth. It never will be like in the past when there was a lot of credit being thrown into the property sector and housing prices going up like crazy. I mean, housing prices could still go up in the future, but the point here is that I don't think we should see these numbers and just say this is a collapse of China or some long term necessarily, and that Chinese government still has many ways to kind of manage this process, and I think certainly avoid any type of extreme financial collapse. Okay. The other thing is that just looking at some of the numbers that people are looking at, it really is this real estate investment that accounts for a lot of private investment in China as well. So there's also been concern that private investment in China has been very sluggish, but that's really the same thing as saying the property rights, the property sector has been a problem. If you look at non-property business investment, private investment, it's been much better. It's been very reasonable in terms of the growth rate this year. Okay. All right, maybe I can move to the next slide, which is about the growth rate in China. So you can see here that growth rates have been trending down in China well before the pandemic and continue to do so post-pandemic in terms of how we project. But the growth rates still are projected at 4 to 5%. For a while. I think over time we've done ADB's done a longer term research paper which suggests that it will decline gradually, and in 20 years it'll be closer to 2% a year as the growth potential of the economy given kind of current trends. And the government needs to, in the short term, really focus on encouraging consumers and investors getting their confidence back, debt deleveraging, especially in the property sector, and also repairing the fiscal space of local governments. And this is a big challenge in China because, as I mentioned, a lot of the fiscal revenue depended on the property sector for local governments. And China has not established a good public finance system which allows local governments other ways to collect revenue and spend it. And so even now, a lot of the stimulus that China is trying to promote to help support recovery in terms of local government spending is in the form of bond issuance. But now debt levels are already pretty elevated in China, both among local governments, also at the corporate level, and at the government level to some extent. So there's, I think the government has limited space to do that, although there's certainly space remaining for them to help prop up growth. If you look to the medium or long term, I think there are structural factors do come into play, And these have been occurring for some years, really since the financial crisis over a decade ago. And one is population aging, which has been well documented, that the absolute size of the Chinese labor force is now declining, and the percentage of old people is increasing. But there's been a productivity slowdown occurring in China over the past decade. And so this is really an area where the government needs to do quite a lot of, I think, analysis and pay policy attention to. The key, of course, is how to promote real innovation and competition. And I think most recently, there really was a lot of lost confidence of the private sector in China in terms of investment because of kind of unpredictable regulations and a feeling of uncertainty. Earlier this summer, the State Council and the party issued a joint policy about reinvigorating private enterprises in China and made a lot of commitments to saying private enterprise interests will be protected, intellectual property, equal access to credit, all of these things that sounded, well, nice. And that's exactly the right thing for the Chinese government to do. There's also been reports that the Chinese government has tried to reassure the big platform companies, including Alibaba and other companies, that things are going to be very predictable and get back to normal. And so I think there's some evidence that this should support recovery as well. But of course, the proof is in the pudding. And so I think it will take time to restore this confidence, but it should be a high priority. And the other aspect of restoring private sector, a robust private sector, which has to be the driver of future growth in China, is to have open competition. Because one aspect of state-led growth is kind of preferential treatment or status for state enterprises, and also allowing for various barriers to entry. Sometimes local governments also support those barriers by kind of picking winners and having favorable, even firm-specific policies. And I think right now China is at a point where it does have quite a lot of technology, entrepreneurialism, a lot of smart and creative people, but they really need to have an even playing field to really grow in a robust way and support the overall development of the economy. And I think that really can't be overstated. And so the recent policy turn is in the right direction, but I think it's really early to say how much it can really change the perception and the confidence of the private sector. Let me stop there. I have one last slide, and which is just one sentence really, and that is that even with kind of slower growth in China, if you look at where growth in GDP is going to come from in the region, it's still China's going to be about half of growth, right? And this is just a compositional effect. We've had a rule of thumb for some time that 1% higher growth in China leads to 0.3% higher growth in the rest of Asia. But of course, that depends on the nature of kind of what's happening. But that's just a general rule. So China is really important. India is becoming also more important. This is a PPP comparison. If it's not a PPP comparison, then China is even more important relative to India. So let me stop there, and thank you for your attention.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Some particularly interesting points on decoupling, I thought, and putting the property sector problems into perspective. I forgot to say that Mr. Parker is going to have to leave this event 15 minutes or so before the end. So when we turn to questions, I will prioritize the initial questions on him. I also forgot to say that he's a well-known expert on China's economy and has directed several large-scale research projects in China. He has more than 2 decades of experience as a development economist and worked for a broad range of issues, including poverty and inequality, intergenerational mobility, microfinance, migration, and labor markets. So let's now turn to Lyric Hughes Hale, who, as I said, is Director of Research at Hale Strategic in Chicago. Her work focuses primarily on China and Asia, with a special emphasis on economics, science, technology, and the media. She also serves as editor-in-chief of EconVue, which publishes the Hale China report. She hosts the Hale Report, a podcast series on global economics. In 1998, she founded China Online, a groundbreaking publication which provided China business news in English on the web. She's a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, the Association for Asian Studies, the American Economic Association, the Australian Economic Leadership Dialogue, and the Bretton Woods Committee. So, Lyric, over to you, please. Sorry, no volume. Sumimasen.
I'm unmuted now. I can see.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Anthony. It's nice to be here. I think I was here maybe, I wish I were there in person where I was about 15 years ago, I think, when I visited and we made a presentation, I think also about China, if I remember. But I'm very pleased to be here today from joining you from Chicago. And a lot of the points that Dr. Park made, I would like to underline and underscore because I substantially agree with everything that he said. The question that we're dealing with today is how serious are China's economic problems? And, I would say they're serious, but perhaps not as serious as the problems that we're facing momentarily in the United States with the debt ceiling and a deficit that has doubled recently. These will have inflation and potentially more interest rate hikes, which will have an effect on the entire world that I think will be greater than the effect of China's economy. One thing that they both have in common, though, the US economy and China's economy, is that they both have significant and growing shadow banking systems, which pose unknown risks to everyone. And I think that that's, if there is going to be something that happens, if there's a trigger, I would imagine it would come there, much like with the Silicon Valley Bank and those sorts of things that have been occurring as our financial system has been growing more complex. One thing that I find very interesting in the past few years is how both China and the United States have become less devoted to international institutions. At first, China really focused on institutional capture of some of these institutions, including the WTO, of course, which was instrumental to their emerging growth, but which now they've largely abandoned and don't agree with because I guess there have been cases that have been decided against them there. I think that based on current behavior, that China, like the United States before it, has concluded that the thing that's most important to its survival is its bilateral relationship with the US. I think it was quite significant that President Xi did not appear himself to deliver his speech at the BRICS conference. There's a lot of speculation about why that might be, but I think it speaks to this potentially shift in his thinking that China is not just one of the BRICS, that they are just the equal partner of the United States in this world. In both countries are very good at trying to hurt each other. We have tit for tat diplomacy that's going on all the time. It makes it very unstable to watch what's going on. If you're on Fox News on a Sunday morning, all you hear about is China, 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 and the problems that China is creating. This is contributing, by the way, to a very anti-China atmosphere in the United States. But the reality is that in the United States right now, we do not need jobs to be reshored to the United States. In actual fact, we have more jobs than we have people who are willing to work and who can also pass drug screening tests. So it's not about, I think, the jobs anymore. It's about something different, and I think it's greater competition. One hot button issue that relates to this is climate change, of course, and China is continuously called out on its carbon footprint, all of that, which I find actually quite ironic. Most people assume that the reason and trying to do a little bit of a deep dive on this is advertise. Most people assume that the reason that we moved our corporate factories to China in such great numbers was to get a cheaper price for labor. But the China price, even at the very beginning, was somewhat of an illusion when you added in logistics and training and other kinds of costs. The real reason behind it was, I believe, the increasing number of EPA regulations at the time and the difficulties in getting permits for new factories in the United States, which, by the way, still persists. So in a way, we offloaded the pollution from US factories and manufacturing outfits to China, and they face the impact of that. Last January, once in a while I get a lot of things wrong, but once in a while I get things right, and I think it's interesting to look at why we get calls either right or wrong. But last January, every major investment house was saying that China would have a rebound in growth. That was the mantra. And in January, in my newsletter, I said that that would not happen, and that a relief rally is not equivalent to a return in consumer confidence. And actually, that is what has happened. But right now, I think that the new mantra is that China is going to fall apart any second. And I think, like Dr. Park, I agree that China might muddle through instead. That, I think, is what the reality is. They're not going to fall apart, but it's not going to be the robust kind of growth that we came to expect from them. But it's fair to judge anything about what's going on in China. The base that we're comparing to in the last 2-3 years was very low. So any increases off that base, we have to really look at it. We have to broaden our time horizon to really understand them. In addition, data from China is very difficult to get now. Many data sources that I used to be able to depend on are not available anymore to foreign researchers and academics. So that makes it quite difficult. Everybody knows the famous case of the youth unemployment, and how once those figures were not what they expected, they decided not to share them anymore. So judging what China's economy is doing is a very much more difficult task than it used to be. You know, one of the things I see people looking at is you know, why Chinese consumption is so low, and why at the same time ours is so high. And I think it's not an economic question, it's really a cultural question. What do I mean by that? Today is the anniversary of September 11th. And back in 2001, a very curious thing that happened was that instead of consumption plunging, as you might expect in an emergency, US consumers bought right after. You can see it in the figures right in the final quarter of 2001. So Americans I think were kind of born and bred to consume, and that's what we do under stress. And Chinese consumers, because of their different history, have been also, and because of the institutional issues that they face now, have been incentivized to save. So I think this is just a difference in the way that people are brought up generation to generation as well. And those are very persistent, sticky kinds of behaviors. As some people are watching now China stumble, they seize upon the failures of communism or authoritarianism, and they say that's not working. But in my view, China's current difficulties are not caused by those factors, which after all existed during China's great economic boom. In fact, the greatest economic boom that we've known in history. Instead, I believe that what is happening now is the result of institutional weaknesses that were masked during a period of high growth as reforms were delayed. Now, as the tide is rolling out, we're able to see the weaknesses that are emerging. China is groaning under the increased burdens of an anti-corruption campaign and a much larger and more complex economy that's now inextricably, not as it was before, but now inextricably tied to the global macro economy. So instead of institution building, what went on was anti-corruption and a legal approach to a system. I first went to China in 1979. I tend to look at things in a developmental way rather than a moral or ethical construct. Corruption is a developmental issue. When institutions are weak, people naturally seek other ways to accomplish what they need to get done. And paying bribes is, for example, a way of doing that. And I think that it's unfortunate that this period of high growth wasn't used to create more lasting reforms and stronger institutions. A good example of this is just what we've been talking about, the property bust. But I don't think property as a sector can be considered on a standalone basis. One thing that China needs to get right is taxes. Actually, it's a failure of its taxation system so that local bureaucracies do not become investment houses, which has just been what has happened. It's because of over-centralization. Local Chinese governments, for example, in the United States, we have property taxes. Local property taxes support our schools, education, and a variety of other services. Local governments in China are also expected to do that, but they do not have an independent source of income. So lacking that income, but having those responsibilities, they invested in these idiotic projects that were kind of doomed to failure from the beginning. And now it's all coming home to roost. I think another issue that China has that affects its economy is political grudges. I think those actually figured prominently in public discussions in both the United States and China. The continuous invocation of the century of humiliation ignores the valuable role that the treaty ports had in modernizing the Chinese economy. The current furor, and I would say it's a furor if you've watched any of the Chinese media, over the discharge of treated water from Fukushima is a reflection, I believe, of unhealed wounds from World War II, as is the status of Taiwan. Trade relations suffer as a result of these unresolved issues. I also find it kind of funny that China is so infuriated by comparisons to Japan's period of economic stagnation. Right now, very hot topic is the Japanification of China. But I think that's really a stretch, because China did not reach the levels that Japan's economy did before this current lull created. I'd be very interested in hearing what the audience thinks about that. At the same time, in the United States, there's discussion of sinicization. We have begun US industrial policy, tech regulation, control of the media, and a program of Made in America, the very same program we criticized China for. There's a lot of political infighting going on in China right now, which makes me think that we're at some kind of pivot. Nikkei had a very good story about political infighting at Beidaihe, struggle sessions that were purported to take place with Xi Jinping. We can see signs of a shift, though, in Xi Jinping's leadership through the recent sudden disappearance, not even departures, disappearances of both the Minister of Foreign Affairs and the Minister of Defense, and previously the exile of business leaders such as Jack Ma. This atmosphere has certainly frozen policy making and investment, both domestic and foreign. Sadly, I believe forgiveness has no place with China's leaders. I mentioned the diplomatic about face. Xi Jinping also did not show up at the G20 meeting. And for the UNGA, the United Nations General Assembly meetings, he's sending not the Minister of Foreign Affairs, the old new Minister of Foreign Affairs, but China's ceremonial vice president. there seems to be a downgrading of international relations. In regards to private enterprise, I think that the messages are conflicting. The NDRC has issued the kind of things under the State Council saying that they are going to welcome private investment, but I don't think that that's coming from the top. I think there is a split in terms of policy, so this has to be watched very carefully. A related issue I'm watching is currency devaluations. If one country, Japan or China, suddenly devalues, we could see a wave of competitive devaluation and a race to the bottom, similar to what happened during the Asian financial crisis of 1998. The continued strength of the dollar is playing a role here. And in the Asian financial crisis, China really played a heroic role by not devaluing when everybody else around them was, including Korea. All this leads to, what do companies do? What do Japanese companies, what do American companies do about doing business with China? Secretary of Commerce Gina Raimondo recently said that after her visit to China, that US businesses are calling China uninvestable. The mood in Washington, as I've suggested, is not to support US businesses in China anymore, and witnessed President Biden's visit yesterday to Vietnam to focus on alternatives. So overall, I think the view from Washington is much more serious and much more defensive than we think, and this will affect China. I think there are many in the administration who see China as an existential threat. So I think you all know Kurt Campbell, well known in Japan. I believe he is one of those people who really views China as a threat. So since our economies are intertwined, that's germane to how bad things are, or will get, or might be in China today. Thank you.
Thank you, Lyric. A lot of meat in that for discussion later. So let's turn to Jesper, who worked from 1985 as a research fellow at the University of Tokyo and the University of Kyoto before building his career in finance. He served as a managing director and chief economist for major US investment banks, JP Morgan, Japan Securities, and Merrill Lynch, Japan Securities. He's an expert director at the Japan-based Monex Group, an investment committee member of the Japan Catalyst Fund, and he serves on the board of OIST, which is the Okinawa Institute for Science and Technology. So, Jesper, please.
No, and first of all, a big thank to Albert and Lyric, for really a fantastic overview. As you know, I know nothing about China. I, know a little bit about Japan. And, Lyric sort of talked a little bit about, the current debate about Japanification of China. So I thought I'd send some highlight there. But at the outset, I want to make two comments, just linking on to what Lyric said. Albert is very polite in sort of doing all the forecasts, but in the real world now, and I work in finance, if I have an LP, a limited partner in my fund, who is from China, the American investors will leave. This is just the reality. I think, we cannot overemphasize how serious, the drawing of lines and the building of walls, blocking China out, actually have become already in the real world. This is not just about semiconductors, but in the world of capital flows, you see a very, very serious ring fencing. If you're from the wrong team, that means that the other members on the team can no longer play with you. So it's very, very serious there. On the whole process of Japanification, I mean, Albert, you remember it was in the mid-1990s, and I think it was, China beginning to really, do these 11, 12, 13% growth rates, while it became clear in the mid-1990s that Japan was indeed, entering a period of stagnation. And I was out with a bunch of politicians. And, around midnight, the former Prime Minister Nakasone showed up. And, after a little bit of drinking, I mustered my courage and sort of said, well, Mr. Nakasone, China is on the rise, Japan is on the decline. What are you going to do about it? And he looked into the eyes of everybody, and then he turned to me and said, Koll-san, we will keep doing what we're doing and wait for them to screw it up. And so are we at this point? Now, if you look objectively, at the data points, there are some similarities. I mean, most important in the world of finance, according to the BIS, you effectively have the non-financial leverage in the system in China is now just shy of 300% of GDP. And that was exactly where Japan was at the peak of the bubble economy. And, Japan obviously delevered, and the balance sheet recession, basically, took about a decade. And you had the corporate sector deleveraging to the extent of about 50% of GDP, and the household sector to the extent of about 15% of GDP. And it's obviously when you pay back debt, that's monies that are not available for investment, that are not available for consumption. So from that perspective, I think it's quite right, to sort of have, to have concerns about the deleveraging that is going to have to take place, and that the leadership in the People's Republic of China wants to take place, that's going to subtract from the purchasing power that goes, into the overall economy. Very interesting when you compare and contrast, at the top level, there's a huge difference. And that is that you remember Japan throughout the 1980s went through a radical process of deregulation. And actually throughout the 1990s, American policy was very explicit at opening up Japan to the global economy. And just give you the data. Imports as a percent of GDP, in the late 80s, early 90s, were just around 4 to 5%. Today, it's 18%. So all this pressure to open up the Japanese economy, to allow greater arbitrage of, cheaper products from the rest of the world, was actually stated and, aggressive American policy. And ironically, that coincided with, of course, at the time, America spurning on the development of the People's Republic of China. As Lyric pointed out, lots of foreign direct investment into the People's Republic of China. America putting a lot of emphasis and priorities on getting China into the World Trade Organization, right? And so the irony is, right, that as a result of that, actually, and this is what you see is of the increase in imports, right, from 4 or 5% of GDP to 18% of GDP, basically more than half of that actually came from the People's Republic of China. And as you know, the nexus between Japan and the People's Republic of China is unbelievably dense, right? It is probably the most dense economic relationship that you have in the world. China now is Japan's largest trade partner on both the export side and on the import side. Very important. And by the way, in aggregate, Japan still runs a trade surplus, right, with the People's Republic of China. So it's very competitive. It's also quite interesting that, at a more practical level, I mean, the two richest men in Japan made their fortunes through the People's Republic of China, right? Mr. Yanai with Uniqlo, taking, Japanese looms that had become, uncompetitive, replacing them to the People's Republic of China and then arbitraging, the products back into Japan. The point being, for the macroeconomy, right, the result of the, number one, opening of the Japanese economy, largely because of American pressure, and the emergence of China as the factory of the world, right, to a large extent funded, right, with Japanese capital, right, actually improved the terms of trade of the Japanese economy quite tremendously, right? This is very, very important. And you can basically calculate that, throughout the 1990s until about 2012, 2013, China's contribution to Japan's GDP constantly added between 1 and 1.5%. So what I'm trying to say is that without China, Japan would have had closer to a depression. With China, right, because of the positive impact that you had on the purchasing power, good deflation for the Japanese consumers, plus the growth in trade, right, you actually had a positive contribution. And it's, of course, a big question mark. Where from the rest of the world are you going to get a growth engine like the one that you had over the last 20 years from the People's Republic of China? I think Albert pointed out that just for Asia, and you can argue about the numbers until you're blue, but roughly half of the growth, right, for Asia, came from the impetus from the People's Republic of China. If I do this back of the envelope, basically about a third of global growth, right, came over the last 20 years because of the capital formation and the consumer side that we had in the People's Republic of China. And the trick is, of course, that it was wonderful because it's ultimately, Lyric may disagree a little bit, but basically it's a homogeneous market that you're dealing with, right? While, of course, if you look at the BRICS or the BRICS Plus, these sort of future blocks that are being built, they're not homogeneous markets, right? They're deviously diverse, whether it's, Egypt or whether it's South Africa, or whether it's Argentina now being part of this. This requires a very, very much more complex sort of way of dealing with things. So the key point here is that, really, for the risk to the People's Republic of China from here, that you have this, that actually the risk is that the backstop, the safety valve that over the last 20 years, the growth burst in China provided for Japan and allowed for a gentle Japanification, that there is actually a risk that, that impetus is not going to be there, and that as a result of that, potentially, the risk is going to be much larger. Two final points before we open it up for the floor, right? The first one is really one of, and Lyric alluded to this a little bit, is institutional stability. I mean, people forget, right? Japan had the most stable government in the world, right, until 1993, when the LDP broke up. And as you know, since 1989 until 2012, Japan had 16 prime ministers and 24 finance ministers, right? I mean, an enormous amount of regime uncertainty that came through, and as a result of that, obviously, sort of, instability in terms of if you and I are Toyota, if you and I are a large corporation, if I don't know what the rules are going to be in my home country, investing overseas, right, becomes a much, much more attractive option. And so it's obviously, something for the discussion, whether there is a risk or how high is the risk of regime uncertainty inside the People's Republic of China. And then a final point I want to make in the here and now. The two big changes that have happened over the last couple of years is number one, the reality that defense spending, right, is now on the agenda. And it is very interesting to see Korea actually over the last 3 years having emerged as a major defense supplier in the world. I don't know whether you're familiar, Korea last year did about $18 billion of defense exports, right? In the years before that, they basically ran at $3 to $4 billion, right? So huge change that has actually happened. And so I think, sort of looking ahead, unfortunately, given the realities of, the US's position in particular, right, that those smaller countries caught between, the United States and the People's Republic of China, that defense spending, I think, is something that we're going to have to look at very, very carefully. And that's obviously something that is going to be, affecting Japan. The final point I wanted to make is that, in terms of how corporate Japan reacts and lives with the new realities here, it's very, very straightforward. And you may be aware that when President Biden, last year passed the IRA, right, the Inflation Reduction Act, which is really a very coordinated industrial policy approach, within 36 hours, you had Toyota, Keyence, Panasonic, and Pioneer announce about $20 billion of new factories to be built in the United States of America. Right? So there's no question that in terms of, what is the new global reality, irrespective of whether China grows at 3% or whether China grows at 8%, there's no question that from a Japanese corporate perspective, an America First strategy, right, is actually being turbocharged, right? And that's where the foreign direct investment, is actually flowing. So that's kind of like what I wanted to say, and I look forward to your questions and to the discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Jesper. Provocative and stimulating as usual. Let's turn to the questions first from the room. And if you have questions that are addressed specifically to Albert Park, please raise your hands on those first. I'd like to ask him one quick question, if I may, which is you touched on the point about decoupling from China, especially of other Asian countries. This is a crucial point, I think, and you also said that the RCEP may provide a framework which will stabilize that. But just briefly, a little bit more, in your view, about how serious this decoupling of Asian countries from the Chinese economy is likely to be. I mean, will they simply refuse to decouple, or under US pressure will an increasing number decouple, do you think?
I think they have a strong incentive not to decouple, so that's what they'll try to do as long as they can manage that politically. And I think it's a mistake for the US or other countries to try to force their hand on this issue, because it'll hurt the very partners they're trying to strengthen in some sense. And it's a much more productive for them and helpful, I think, approach to just engage more with them in investment and trade, and give them more options if they feel that somehow the China engagement is, too much, et cetera. I mean, most countries have a pragmatic sense, I think, in the region to balance interests, and so they like Chinese investment, they like Western investment, they'd like to have a balanced portfolio and not be over dependent on any one source. And some of the more dynamic economies in the regions really have choice, because a lot of people want to invest, and they do a good job managing these issues. Other countries, I think, are less attractive to global investors, but China has still stepped up as an investor, and they tend to have a much stronger engagement from China. So I think we would like to see healthy competition, not efforts to segment markets. Global trade has been good for the region, and I think most policymakers in the region feel that way. So what will happen, I don't know. I mean, it's a bit unpredictable. But I think there has been a pretty, throughout all of the recent, with the trade war and with the more recent kind of tensions, et cetera, I think the leaders in the region have stuck pretty firm to this line of taking a fairly pragmatic view and still supporting open multilateral trade and investing to the extent that, that they can.
Okay. All right.
Can I say one thing just from the Japanese perspective? What's very interesting is that, you obviously had, before all this politicization going on, you obviously had a shift in relative labor costs, right? I mean, China, for all intents and purposes, if you and I want to hire a software engineer in Shanghai, he or she is now actually more expensive than one for, even in Tokyo, right? And certainly compared to Hanoi and other industries. So from a Japanese perspective, it was wasn't sort of a lot of the politics, right, that forced the shift in foreign direct investment, right? But it really was the fact that China, per capita income is now, $12,000, $13,000. And relative to Bangladesh, relative to India, relative to Indonesia, now it is advantageous and economically rational to actually build into the rest of Asia.
And one other comment on investment is that, it's very interesting. Research has found that, some of the countries that have benefited from the U.S.-China trade war, in that the U.S. is importing much more from them, like Vietnam, the sectors in which imports have increased from those countries, we also see very clear increase in imports into those countries from China, and we see Chinese investment in these. So Chinese companies also realize that, both for perhaps labor cost reasons, but also increasingly for geopolitical diversification reasons, they're very anxious to invest and build Chinese factories in other countries, including Mexico.
Mexico is the big winner.
Mexico's getting all of these Chinese companies coming in.
All right. Questions from the floor, please. Do we have any questions from the floor? Yes, Dave, please go to the microphone. Please go to the microphone and identify yourself. And
Hi, I'm Dave McCombs, and as we met before, yeah. So I'm just wondering, I know you don't give investment advice, but I'm very curious as to whether the big theme here does seem to be that the political atmosphere is at odds with the economic atmosphere.
could you speak into the microphone?
Sorry. Yeah, so the theme here seems to be that there's some geopolitical pressure that is at odds with the actual economics of the situation. Is this an investment opportunity in China then, in that asset prices are actually below where they could be in an environment that was just based on the economic process without this? So is the risk so high, the geopolitical risk versus the asset price? How do you view that dynamic?
I haven't done that kind of analysis of the asset prices and how they reflect the geopolitical risk, but I guess the market price is the market price. So it's baking in all of these perceived risks in investment in China, and I think probably those risks differ somewhat depending where you're coming from and the relationship of your own country to China and its stability and expected stability going forward. I think even within China, there's still quite a lot of uncertainty that investors perceive in terms of what the Chinese government will allow or not allow. Just when the pandemic was starting, there was a huge, all these regulations on high tech, a lot of unpredictable regulations that really continues to, I think, have a chilling effect. So I think, I have a colleague, in private equity in China, and they're really focusing on investing in areas that they feel confident that government is going to support strongly for some years, and that would be renewable energy, for instance, as one area, and other areas that are not likely to be subject to unpredictable regulation, et cetera. So this is the process, I think, of the Chinese government still trying to rebuild trust with the private sector. I think they realize it's important, and hopefully that will be the direction in which things continue to go. But I think most investors obviously take a wait and see, let's see how things evolve attitude.
Do you want to comment on that?
My personal opinion is again, when politics gets so aggressive and really, the largest country and the most powerful country in the world, the only thing that they can agree on is that they don't like China and will go out of their way to exclude China, I'm not sure I want to be in there, right? But as Albert, sort of pointed out, there's way smarter ways to play this. For example, Mexico is a huge beneficiary of the whole thing, and Mexico certainly is in, as it were, the Western camp. So I think that, yes, be my guest if you want to be bold and daring. You can go to where where the battle is being fought, but money is fungible, and there are way smarter ways to play that. Like, for example, the Japanese market, which is going to be a big beneficiary from the whole thing.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think it's very difficult to pick sectors. who would have thought the educational sector would have been targeted? That really shocked me. And right now, the sector that they probably need most of all, the healthcare sector, is being targeted for quote unquote anti-corruption. So I think picking sectors is very difficult process, and could be upended for these political reasons we're all talking about.
Which is interesting, just for 30 seconds, right? Again, there's actually a similarity in Japan, because the policy elite, at the peak of the bubble here, was, very cognizant of the fact that the next generation could never afford to live in an apartment within a 2-hour commute, right? And it was stated policy, right, to deflate the bubble so that the next generation of Japanese could actually, buy their apartment. And Mr. Xi Jinping, again, I'm not a China expert, right? But if he tells me, homes are for living, not for speculation, that sounds extremely similar, right? In terms of the adjustment that you have there. And again, I'm not a socialist, right? But, the government, trying to boost the purchasing power of the people, right, through government intervention, fine. It's not the American way, but it's certainly the way that Japan and the People's Republic of China manage their economies.
Actually, let me respond. Actually, it is the American way to put big subsidies in the hands of households, and it's actually not the Chinese way. In fact, China has been really criticized this year for not being aggressive enough in more direct transfers to households to boost consumption. This government has been very reluctant to do that. They tend to do things to maybe subsidize certain types of purchases, but more with an eye towards supporting sectors they think need help or are priority sectors for the economy, not putting. So, just as a quick, things are not always as they seem.
I think there's another reason. For the subsidization of consumers. Yes, everybody got a check, but the average American has $2,000 in cash in their checking account, in their savings account. And in China, that number is closer to $26,000. So sending $1,200 or $1,400 to someone with $2,000 in their account has a huge impact. Sending that same amount of money, which would be impossible given China's population, would not have the same impact.
Okay. Do we have any questions online? If not, I think we need to go a little bit deeper, if we can, into this question of how structural China's problems are, as distinct from cyclical. Because Lyric, you raised some very interesting points, and Albert Park may wish to comment on these, that China has not kept up institutionally. It's grown very fast. It didn't give enough attention to institutional reform. You also made the very interesting point that local financing in Japan, in Tokyo, in the local regions of China is very insufficient outside of property sales and so on. So if these are serious structural deficiencies, doesn't that imply that the growth rates are going to remain slower for longer, to use a well-known phrase? So, Lyric first, what do you think?
Yes.
The answer is yes.
Yes. I think, there's hidden things. For example, why isn't there a property tax in China? I'll tell you why. There's opposition because apartments were used as the currency of corruption. So there are a number of Chinese officials who have 20, 30, and they're not that high ranking, have 20 or 30 apartments. So if they suddenly have to pay property taxes, that's then registered, and there are carrying costs for this. So they're opposing this move. So you have to really dig deep to understand this institutional, I think, just the reason that they're frozen in terms of some of these policies that seem logical, but if you dig deeper, you find why they exist.
Yeah. Okay, but you started off on a rather optimistic note, saying China's problems are not quite as bad as people are painting them. But so, again, very quickly, are these structural issues going to hold back the growth rates more than has been suggested, or not?
I think it depends what happens, as we all know, there are a lot of very smart people in China, wonderful economists who know exactly what should be done, but they've been prevented from doing so because of what, Jasper rightly calls the extreme politicization of everything that's been happening recently there. So once that ends, and I think that there's a battle going on now, and I think that you will see that the economists come back into the limelight more.
Okay.
Sure. I mean, one other consequence of not having property taxes in China is, as Larry said, there's very low carrying cost to speculate on real estate investment, which is one reason there's been so much inflation in the housing sector. The lack of a property tax reflects an institutional weakness in China. People have been advising China to reform its local public finance system really for decades. And we really haven't seen, I think, a sustainable system. I mean, the reason China has, for many years, they stopped allowing local governments to impose their own taxes is actually out of concern that it would lead to a lot of ad hoc, burdensome taxes imposed on both consumers and businesses, and had problems earlier in the reform period. So they said, let's not give them that scope. But it does mean the government needs to come up with other ways to finance needed investments at the local level, including education, et cetera. It doesn't mean they can't figure out ways to do that, but it's not a natural kind of decentralized fiscal system that we would like to see. The broader question, is it structural? Or I actually think there's still quite a lot of growth momentum in China. I mean, there's still very innovative firms across many sectors. I've done a lot of firm surveys in southern China, and you visit these companies, and they're very charismatic CEOs, really who understand the markets in a very deep way. And so that's a sense in which the government kind of has to just let these firms lead and get out of their way more and facilitate what they can do. There's been a lot of lost opportunities in terms of how the financial system in China has steered resources, not so much to the private sector. I think China will muddle through. I think these institutional, there's also an extraordinary level of competency in some aspects of what Chinese leaders are able to, and their knowledge and understanding of what's actually going on. But reform has been very frustratingly so in some areas in local public finance, in extending the retirement age, which is a natural way to increase labor force participation, which they've announced a couple of times, but have never been able to politically kind of seal the deal and implement. Okay, let me stop there.
Albert, can I follow up on that? And
sure.
like, how do you think about excess capacity, right? Because it's all there's very smart people, blah, blah, blah. Of course, we know that, right? But, the transition from, the manufacturing sector build-up, right? Japan being the factory of the world, right? Clearly has become saturated, right? With the population declining, the demand for washing machines is going to start to decline, right? If you look at some of the data just cursory, right, there's enormous amounts of excess capacity, right, in some of the white goods, what we used to call brown goods. We can always talk about the sexy stuff, healthcare, high tech, et cetera, but at the very, very level, isn't there a big risk that China is going to dump its excess capacity into the rest of the world and thereby cause a deflation shock?
I'm not sure about a global deflation shock, so we don't have to be alarmist about these things. But yeah, sure.
We need that.
I think one of the weaknesses of Chinese policy is in the area of competition and allowing unprofitable firms to just collapse. In fact, even through the pandemic and even now, the Chinese government has tried to protect employment by extending various types of subsidies and loan repayments, et cetera, to all sorts of enterprises, including small and medium enterprises. And I think that's put them also in a much bigger deficit position than they otherwise would have been. And I think it's understandable, that's how they kind of do social protection in a way, but it does start to impose costs in the economy if you're subsidizing firms which are no longer really competitive there. You need kind of the invisible foot to really promote a much healthier type of productivity, allowing productive firms to grow and less productive firms to die. And there's actually been data analysis in China of firm level data which shows that this kind of it used to be that China was seeing a lot of entry of very productive firms and exit of less productive firms, which is positive for growth, and that this pattern has really been much less evident in the last 10 or 15 years. So that also perhaps reflects a lack of a fully level playing field, and also a policy stance that allows inefficient firms to die.
Yeah, which is the Japanification, right? That you've got the zombie companies.
Okay, right.
Zombie companies. Questions? Yes, Jesper, please.
Nishimura, freelance. Thank you very much for the presentation. As long as hearing the presentation of Mr. Park, I had an impression that China is showing the moderate or a stable growth in the post-pandemic period. So my question is rather political. How do you assess the possibility of that Chinese economy affects the decision of the leaders of China on the issue of Taiwan? There's another kind of possibility that it takes further action in China in a few years later. Thank you very much.
I'm not going to comment on the Taiwan issue. I mean, I think the government position has been stated very clearly for many years. But one comment on growth targeting in China. I mean, this year the government, in its national Congress meeting, the premier really outlined that China is not focusing so much on growth, maximizing growth. They want high quality development. And that it's been a few years now where announced growth targets are only guidance. They're not really very strict targets that the government understands that now development involves aspects other than growth. And some people have even argued that some of the regulatory changes that have created quite a lot of uncertainty have been done for similar reasons, that there is a goal to make sure that the growth is not producing ill social effects on youth or other things. So I think that's a good thing, that growth is no longer just a target number for growth, and that there's a broader kind of concept of what development is. But how that gets realized, I think we'll see.
Okay. I'm going to have to... You have to go. All right. We will send you. Well, let me thank Albert Park very sincerely for his very informed and interesting contributions. Thank you indeed. We look forward to seeing you here again soon. And you will receive your one-year honorary membership by mail. It's not available at the moment. I'm sorry about that, but anyway, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It's been a great pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. Okay. If we don't have questions from Flora, I'd like to raise one question directed at Lyric and also Jesper, really, which is, the political situation in the United States may change next year depending on the outcome of the election. So how much could this, depending on the outcome of the election, how much could this whole dynamic, the antipathy between the United States and China, for instance, and the whole question of delinking and so on and so forth, how much could this change and make all of this irrelevant, do you think? I mean, speculating on what the outcome of the election might be. Lyric.
Well, many people consider that President Biden's China policy is really Trump 2.0. And should President Trump be reelected, which is in a CNN poll shows him 1 point ahead of President Biden, his team has said that they will continue the policy and increase, for example, sanctions and tariffs and so forth. So it seems to me no matter which party wins, China will be important. I don't think it's as important in the election as they think it is. Americans, every kind of survey shows that they don't care about foreign affairs as much as everybody thinks. And it's an election issue sometimes for the elite, but for the average voter, that's not what's driving them. I can tell you that what will drive people here in Chicago is law and order, just as an example, and as always, the economy.
Okay. Question? Yes, please.
Bill Hall from Ipsos. When I was doing my studies on China 30, 40 years ago, I remember President Pompidou, when he visited, asked Mao Zedong, how many people are there in China? And Mao said, we have no idea, right? Which gets to the statistics issue. In the United States, when you do a survey or a census, you're off by 2%, no matter, even in the most advanced country in the world. With the numbers we're talking about, right, there are serious issues if you have a centrally controlled, not really these days maybe, but there's a whole issue on that. So I think there's a big issue about the reality of the numbers, which have been mentioned by the lady from Chicago. And related to that, I sort of disagree with her in terms of the extra growth potential, because Japan got rich before it got old, right? China, for example, now, you have 250 million people over the age of 65 without a really good healthcare system, right? And 90 million people now have diabetes, right? 90 million people with diabetes, which is a huge issue. Dementia's coming down the tubes like Japan. So I think there's a whole issue that the numbers are not backing up what people are thinking here. So I think it's more of a structural issue. If we look at Japan growing, at 8% in the old days, and China's, I think, hit that wall the same as Japan has, but without getting rich first. That's the sort of question I'd like to throw in.
Okay. Larry, can turn to you first on that, please.
I don't think I disagree with that, actually. I think maybe I wasn't very clear, but I did say I think that Japan did get rich first. So that's a key difference in terms of this Japanization of China. China is not in the same place Japan was when the bubble burst, for sure. So otherwise, I'm not. Was there another point to that question that you think that you'd like me to deal with?
Numbers, the reliability of the data, if you like, on China, how realistic
Okay.
is.
Well, all economic data has problems, including here in the United States. How often do we revise the employment figures? And significantly, it's constantly going on. I think, but China has elected to make them not available at all to foreigners. So maybe they're reliable, but they're just not available. Those are two different issues. And also, that data itself the export of that kind of data is becoming criminalized in China. The data that is owned by foreign companies in China now faces restrictions in terms of exporting it outside of China. I think that's very serious. Makes it very difficult to operate.
Okay. Well, we are up against time. I'd just like to ask Jesper very, very quickly, Jesper, how you see economic relations between Japan and China developing short to medium term. Do you see them improving, staying as they are now, or deteriorating?
No, look, I think that, again, it's an incredibly dense relationship that you have there. Obviously, Prime Minister Kishida is hostage to his, bosses in Washington. And they will finagle that, but the business community here is very, very clear. And as I said, I think that you've got the political element there, but also sort of from a corporate perspective, right? Where do I put fixed asset into place, right? Again, China is just no longer as competitive and as attractive as it used to be. And if plus alpha, you've got sort of a political risk element that you're going to have to consider, then you are more likely to move on to other players. So I think that, what do I think? I think, is there going to be a revival of Japanese foreign direct investment in the People's Republic of China? I think the answer is no. But I think that, politics is only part of the reason. It's really the bare bone economics of that. For example, from a Japanese perspective, if you look at Indonesia, right, it obviously depends what business it is that you're in. Indonesia is now a much more attractive, investment opportunity than the People's Republic of China. Mexico, as was mentioned, is obviously, one of them. And, here in Southeast Asia, there are other smaller countries, right, that also have become relatively much more attractive. Right?
Okay.
So it's a natural shift that's being reinforced, unfortunately, by the political overlay.
Thank you. Very interesting. I think we might even have a separate deep dive event on Japan and Indonesia. But okay, well, we are up against time. I'm afraid we're 10:01, just over. Many thanks to our panelists, including Albert Park, who's actually left. Thank you, Lyric, for coming in. I don't know what time of the morning or afternoon it is there, but thank you.
Dinner time for my dog.
Okay, well, go and get your dog's dinner.
She came scratching at the door.
Okay.
I look forward to seeing you in Tokyo sometime soon.
We hope so, yes. Well, thank you, Lyric. Thank you, Jesper.
Thank you.
Please join me.
Thank you.
Thank you.